Comedy albums, they're making a comeback. What is this, 1967? We have with us Don Steinberg joining us. I don't know where Don is, but he's going to Skype. Don, where are you located right now? Philly. Don is
outside Philadelphia, yep.
Don, fascinating piece today about the comeback of the comedy album. Now, we should caveat that by saying it's not a huge comeback. They don't sell as many comedy albums as they used to, but the very fact that the comedy album still exists was a bit of a shock to me.
It's true. It surprises a lot of people, including some of the old comedians I talked to.
Now, I have to go back and I'll just confess, you know, I had the George Carlin Class Clown album growing up. I mean, that to me was like, you know, one of my key childhood memories. And yet, you know, after that and a few Richard Pryor, it kind of went nowhere, the comedy album.
Yeah, you know, what happened was in the 80s, cable, you could rent videos, comedy clubs exploded, so people didn't need to just sit around the record player and listen anymore.
Isn't it a bit antiquated, though, nowadays, the idea of the comedy album? I mean, so much of comedy is physical, and when you just are listening to something, you have to, you know, through pauses, through murmurs, through other noises, you have to suggest the physical action that is going on the stage live. And today, with the proliferation of YouTube and video, you don't really, you know, you could see it all right there. How is it that this can still work?
It's weird. I mean, it's almost like the act of listening to a comedy album is part of the nostalgia to it. But it does require a different sort of thing. You would think that if it's audio only, you could multitask more, but it's sort of the opposite. You know, you really have to focus on the audio.
Right. And I, you know, go back and a lot of the great comedians, Woody Allen's stand-up album is fantastic. You talk in the piece about a couple of Bob Newhart albums. I was amazed at how well these Bob Newhart albums sold back in the 60s.
Yeah. You know, I told him, I said that the top 200 comedy albums from last year didn't even sell as many as his first two albums. And he said, well, how many copies did my first two albums sell? Because they didn't keep good records back then. And when he asked Warner Brothers how much they sold, they told him that the records were lost in a fire. So he never really found out how many. Right. But it was a mass medium back then. There were 3 TV channels, and if you wanted to hear comedy, you had to buy a record.
But Bob Newhart was also a very deadpan, dry comedian. So, in effect, he wasn't very physical. So you didn't have to actually visualize or see very much of what he was doing.
Right, right. You had to imagine he had this act where he would do half of a phone call, and you really had to work to figure out what was happening on the other side of the call. And that's how he made it a little interactive for
now,
listeners.
Among the people recording albums now, you got Louis C.K., whose videos, if you go to YouTube, you know, the video excerpts of some of his works are extremely popular. I mean, you're talking about millions and millions of views. Louis C.K., who else is out there is doing comedy albums?
Well, you know, Patton Oswalt is doing great. Some of the musical stuff is coming back with, you know, Weird Al had a big album, and Turtleneck and Chain, the Andy Samberg thing, sold very well, and Jimmy Fallon is coming out with a comedy album this year, I think, to cash in on some of the musical stuff that's been going on and some of the songs he's been doing on his show.
Don, final question for you. Is this just a blip in history, meaning are we just on this long-term trend of comedy albums, all forms of, frankly, albums or things that are conceived as albums, just in a steady decline, and this is kind of a small blip, or is this going to be kind of a sustainable comeback for the comedy album?
Well, I think that there will always be a place for audio only, especially now in the car, and you talked about Spotify. Comedy is big on Spotify and on Pandora. And when you're in your car, you're bored, and you always want to have something to listen to.
Well, Don, thank you very much. Excellent piece. Check it out on WSJ.com. Don Steinberg joining us from Philly.